Hello, Minnesota historians. We finished up the 1920s here the other day, and now we are going to be discussing the 1930s. And of course, if the 20s were booming, the 30s were also a bust in Minnesota as we hit the Great Depression. We won't focus a ton on that. We'll focus more on some of the political things, some of the other big events that were occurring in our state during the 1930s. We had talked a little bit about Gopher football in the 20s. It was, the Gophers were a good team. Bronco Nagurski, the famous football player, there's awards named after him, played in the late 20s. And that tradition continued into the 1930s, when we won three national championships: 1934, 35, and 36. The head coach in the 30s was Bernie Bierman, a five-time national championship coach. And some other things about the Gophers at that point. How did we actually get our name, the Gopher State, or why did they select the Gophers for our mascot of our main university? It goes back to a political cartoon in 1857 when we were still a territory, and it was about some different corruption in the state that some people didn't like with the railroads and things like that. And in this political cartoon, it's kind of whatever the reasoning for it. It's not forgotten, but it's not that important at this point. But this guy had these our politicians as striped gophers or spotted gophers, and this was a famous political cartoon that was across the country, ran in newspapers across the country, the Gopher Train, and that became our mascot later on. We were known as the Gopher State. Now, how did we become the Golden Gophers? Well, in 1934, the head coach, Bernie Bierman, wanted the uniform to match the color of the ball. The ball at that point was kind of a gold color, not really that brown color that it is today. It was kind of a lighter brown, maybe you'd say. And so they came up with this gold uniform so that opponents would have a hard time seeing which of our players had the ball. That was the only reason they selected gold. All right, remember Memorial Stadium held 52,000. This was a famous announcer at the time, Hasley Hall, great Minnesota sports writer and broadcaster. He actually was the one on WCCO that gave them the nickname. We're on the radio. I guess I'm not 100% sure if it was WCCO announcing the games in the 30s. Remember, started by Washburn Crosby Company. And so Hall decides, as here come the Gophers right now on the field, calls them the Golden Gophers, and the nickname has stuck. And later on, they select gold and maroon to be their school colors. The other call that Hall made famous was "Holy cow," he would say when something great happened. And now we just hear that expression all the time, and other announcers kind of also help make it famous after him, like Harry Carey. Fauché Tower, which is still standing, was put up right before the 1930s in 1929. And you can see Fauché when you drive into Minneapolis from the south side. So if we're going up to Minneapolis from New Prague, we'll see it as we come into the cities. When it was built in 29, it was the tallest building between Chicago and the West Coast. So it was the skyscraper. It was built mostly by selling stock. Wilbur Fauché had been investing and owning utility companies. So the new utility lines, the power grid that's reaching across the country, telephone lines, he's putting those up and he's getting investors to invest and he's making all this money, and he puts up Fauché Tower. And here you can kind of see it towering above Minneapolis in 1929. It says Fauché on it. Still to this day, it lights up. And for its grand opening, Fauché had ordered a song written, a composition by John Philip Sousa, the famous composer. And in this famous composition, it had been this march, kind of like the Washington Monument March is what it's used for today. But he had paid something like, or was going to pay something like $20,000 for the rights to this march. And all of a sudden, Black Tuesday, stock market crashes, and Fauché loses all his money. So Sousa never got paid, and that song was never played again, basically, for the next 50, 60 years before some people finally bought it from the Souza family for what Fauché wanted it, what he had bought it for, the 20,000 or whatever. So Fauché and his business partner actually went to prison. Maybe they didn't deserve to, but basically the U.S. Department of Justice said it was mail fraud because they had been using mail to like send out advertisements for their stock. They had been using the U.S. Postal Service to do that, and so they went to prison on mail fraud before they were eventually they would be pardoned. I think by either FDR or Truman. FDR, I'm pretty sure, is the guy that pardons them. But here it is as you drive into Minneapolis. You've got the IDS Tower, which is a big building, but here is the Fauché Tower built in 1929. Lit up at night. I'll have an option for you to listen to this. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? Famous Bing Crosby story. It's not about Fauché, but there's parts of it that are basically, it's about people like Fauché, that they basically have the world in their hand, stock market crashes, and they lose everything. They go from being worth millions of dollars to being worth nothing. And so the stock market crash certainly affects Minnesota like it does other places. The Great Depression that was coming, as people start losing their stuff, they start losing their homes, and businesses start laying people off because nobody's buying their stuff. And the next thing you know, 25% of the country is without a job. Minnesotans, not very happy with the current government, decide to vote in Floyd B. Olson, who would be our governor from 1930 to 1936, and he belonged to the Farmer Labor Party. So he was not a Republican, not a Democrat, but a Farmer Labor Party governor, and he was the first of two Farmer Labor Party governors that we're going to have. This is back in the day when the term was 2 years, so he was elected 3 times. And he goes down as one of Minnesota's most impactful governors. He made a lot of changes. He also accepted FDR's New Deal programs. Not every state was on board with those things. The government is creating jobs. Whose money are they using to create those jobs? Taxpayers. So some people looked at that as, and it is, socialism. And some people were very much against it, and some people were very much for it. During the Great Depression, people without a job that could get a job in the New Deal programs were very much for it. Interesting enough, Floyd B. Olson married a New Prague girl, Ada Kraji. I don't know how to say that last name. I don't know anybody with that last name. But in 1915, they got married. He had been born on the north side of Minneapolis. His parents were both immigrants, one from Norway, one from Sweden. He makes a name for himself in the 1920s as a lawyer, going after crooked businessmen. He also goes after the Ku Klux Klan that we had read about that had sprung up in the 20s. And so he makes a name for himself and becomes a popular political figure. As a governor, one of the things that he helps institute is a graduated income tax. That means the more you make, the more you pay. And remember, at this point, income tax was a fairly new thing. It hadn't been around all that long, maybe only 15 years or so, 15, 20 years max. And so an income tax was something that was new. A state income tax that the state's taking money out of your paycheck was new, and it's still around today. Income tax is actually where our country gets most of its money from. Also, as part of FDR's plan, he helps create the state Social Security program for the elderly. He expands state environmental conservation programs as the state creates more state parks, public hunting land, things like that. Equal pay for women, the right for unions to collective bargain for their contract, which had been illegal up to that point in the state, and instituted a minimum wage and a system of unemployment insurance. You talk about unemployment and things like that today. People are being laid off or furloughed from their jobs. They're still getting paid money. Businesses or companies, when they pay workers, money is paid by the business and taken out of workers' paychecks and put into the unemployment fund. If you never get laid off and you never get furloughed, You'll never use any of that unemployment money that is in that big pot. But if you do get laid off or do get furloughed, you can still get paid up to a certain amount of time before you need to find a different job. Or if you get fired, you can go on unemployment. And so that was new at this point. And obviously, in a time like we're dealing with now, those types of things are important. Olson also did want a bill that would put Minnesota's electric utilities, iron mines, oil fields, grain elevators, and meatpacking plants under state ownership. So under this plan, the government would buy those from the owners. The owners wouldn't have a say. They would have to sell, and the state would run them. That never happened. Olson may not have been too serious about it. Some people said that's socialism. Olson said it's not socialism, it's cooperativism. But certainly, just like today, you might consider Olson to be a Bernie Sanders type of politician. He certainly had many fans. He certainly had many people that did not like him. For the same reason, you would have people all fired up about Bernie Sanders today, and you certainly could see that just on social media and stuff like that. There are people fired up about Floyd B. Olson. You would have to read about in the newspaper as opposed to social media back in those days, but he would be kind of on that same line. But he made a lot of changes in Minnesota. Um, people could argue they were bad, people could argue they were good, but he made a lot of changes. Sometimes we have governors that are just there for 4 years or there for 2 years and don't really do anything, good or bad, and they get kind of forgotten. Floyd B. Olson certainly was not forgotten. There was some controversy, some controversial things that happened during his administration. One, there was a newspaper editor that was going after organized crime, and he was assassinated. He was gunned down in front of his wife, and his widow blamed Floyd B. Olson. She said he was connected to the mob, and they were supporting him. And so Liggett was gunned down in 1935. This is the famous mobster that they think did it, Kid Can, or at least he hired somebody to do it. And he was not convicted of the killings. Olson, of course, said he did not have any connection, but there were some connections with the mob and the Teamster unions that Floyd Olson was connected to. And so his Liggett, the newspaper journalist's wife, blamed Olson until the day she died that this happened. Kid Can gets off on the murder because the widow said the guy that shot her husband was Kid Can. Well, the jury just said, well, Kid Can wouldn't have done it. He would have hired somebody else to do it. Some of you Gopher fans know about the famous rivalry that the Gopher football team has with Iowa. We play for the trophy, Floyd of Rosedale. Well, that trophy goes back to Floyd B. Olson and the governor of Iowa, who at the time there was some trouble between the Gophers and Iowa. The year before, the Gophers had roughed up one of Iowa's players. He was an African American. The story was that the Gophers had been taking cheap shots on him. He was hospitalized, and then next year, basically, the Iowa coach or the Iowa newspapers and things were going on. They basically said, well, if they try any of that stuff down here, our fans will come out of the stands. And then the Gopher team was like, well, we're not going to go down there and be assaulted by these fans. And so the governors thought they could kind of calm everything down with a friendly bet. And so the bet was whichever team lost, that governor would have to buy a pig and give it to the other team or the other state's governor. In the end, the Gophers won the game, and the Iowa governor purchased a pig from the Rosedale Farms and named it Floyd and gave it to our governor. And that by the next year, I believe that pig was probably dead and maybe turned into bacon and ham. And so they played for a trophy, and on that trophy is Floyd of Rosedale. We need to get it back. Olson was campaigning in 1936, and he had some stomach problems. Went down to the Mayo Clinic and basically died of stomach cancer. And there were talks that he was a guy that maybe could be running for president someday. He was a guy that kind of got along with both sides, Republicans, Democrats, and his own, of course, his own party, the Farmer Labor Party. And so there was a lot of talk that maybe he could run for president. The Republicans thought maybe he'd run for president as a Republican. The Democrats thought maybe he'd run for president as a Democrat. And when you have a person like that, those are the people that they feel can become president because they speak to both sides. However, he dies young while he was governor, just like we saw with Governor Johnson. Johnson High School named after him now in St. Paul. The Governors is their mascot. And so Floyd Olson, big statue of him here. Highway 55 is the Floyd B. Olson Memorial Highway. You see it runs basically from the cities all the way up to North Dakota here, just west of Alexandria. Here's Kid Cam, the famous gangster. Got his start running moonshine from Stearns County down to Minneapolis and then Chicago. He rose to prominence, really maybe more in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He also kind of was part of the Teamster strike where these truck drivers throughout the city, the mob kind of helped run their union, so some of the union dues went to the mob. And the truck drivers in the city went on strike. And they said they weren't being paid enough and they were working too many hours and not being paid much for those hours. So they went on strike. Well, you think about it, no truck could drive in the cities, could deliver anything, whether you're delivering vegetables, whether you're delivering, packages of that people have ordered, doesn't matter. Whatever they're delivering, they were not there. No trucker was driving in the cities. And if you tried to, they would attack you. The strike got violent. Police wounded 67 strikers, killed 2 of them. Olson declared martial law, brought in the National Guard to put down the strike. So there was trouble brewing. And I will have a video of this for you to watch. Big funeral. I mean, martial law in the streets. National Guard putting down the protest. Strike ends 6 months into it, a compromise between the trucker union and the companies. Now, 1930s, New Deal programs that you learned about in Growth of America, or Modern America, sorry. Do you know that the WPA has 1,266 projects in Minnesota? The WPA has employed 65,000 Minnesota men. The WPA has spent $31 million, actually, yeah, 31 million on wages, material, and supply. So Minnesotans were being put to work through these different organizations. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, built a lot of buildings, sidewalks, roads, streets, put up signs. So lots of people were getting paid through this project. Some of these buildings are still around today. Some of these projects are. 60 miles of streets, curbs, and gutters. When I was a kid, I used to see some of these WPA sidewalks. They're all gone now. They're destroyed and new ones are put in place. They installed 64,000 traffic signs, built over 300,000 feet of sewers, and reconditioned over 100 public schools. Maybe you've gone up to the Minneapolis Armory for a concert. They've had boxing and MMA fights, all sorts of things in the Armory. I know for the National Wrestling Tournament that was supposed to be here this year at the U.S. Bank Stadium, they were going to have a setup in there of wrestling booths and stuff. Fort Snelling National Cemetery was built during by the WPA. The CCC was also big. We had a CCC camp not far from here over in Jordan. And this was a group, this was usually young men out there working, doing different projects, planting trees, digging ditches, that type of thing. And so this also put a lot of Minnesotans to work. A little New Prague history. Our most important doctor, who also was very prominent during the 1930s politically, that we'll talk about. Dr. Edward E. Novak. He was a doctor that moved to New Prague in 1895. You talk about New Prague got like electricity and streetlights in like 1898. So that's the time period. He rode from house to house for much of his career on a horse. He got a nice horse to ride and pay visits to people. He was a very important, besides trying to heal sick people, he had other duties, being a very educated person in an era where most people are not educated past maybe elementary school or middle school. Some of the things he did: promote vaccines throughout the schools, and say, hey, it's important to get these kids vaccinated. He was mayor of New Prague in the 1920s. He was a school board member for over 44 years in the New Prague School District, and he was on the University of Minnesota Board of Regents up in Minneapolis for 18 years. So he did a lot of very important things. He could help people with their finances, and as far as like these are the things you should be investing in or buying. He helped farmers as far as like improving the types of crops they were growing by diversifying. Don't just plant wheat every year. And he also farmed a little bit on his own. Um, he improved the area herds of animals by focusing on purebred stock. We have a red pole avenue over here, and he promoted red pole cattle that you see here, and making sure they're not breeding with other types of cattle, purebred hogs as well. So he had a farm over here where he raised those red pole. He also helped organize New Prague's dairy farmers and farmers with a cooperative, a creamery, so that they'd pool all their milk products together, dairy, and make different dairy products and sell their milk rather than compete against each other. They could go out together and try to get the best price. That creamery used to sit right here. The Bean Mansion is behind this photo. You got like Strikeforce down here. So the creamery used to sit here. When I was a kid, I remember always seeing this old building sit there. You'd bike by. That creamery is now gone. Novak, in the 1930s, was nominated to run for governor as a Democrat. So he is going to be running against Floyd B. Olson at this point, and then Floyd B. Olson dies. So they'll nominate the Farmer Labor Party will nominate a different candidate. However, before the election, the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party cut a deal. The Democrats say, listen, we are worried that that FDR, the president, will lose the election in Minnesota, and that could cost him the national election if he loses the state to the Republican candidate. So they said, hey, Farmer Labor Party, you tell all your constituents, all of your members to vote for FDR, and we will tell all of the Democrats to vote for your governor. And that's the deal that they cut. So Novak doesn't even have a chance really to run for governor, and or even if he would have won the primary, he loses a close one, but there were some shady deals from some candidate from Worthington, I think. But even had he won the election, the primary, he would not have had a chance to even run for governor because the Democrats did not put a candidate out there. All the Democrats just voted for Elmer Benson. Here's kind of a famous photograph. You think, well, okay, Dr. Novak seems pretty important in New Prague, but how important really was he? Well, look at this picture. Here's Dr. Edward E. Novak. Of course, you know who Kennedy is. Here's Lyndon Johnson, Kennedy's vice president, future president Lyndon Johnson. So Novak is here with two presidents. And then another very important person, Hubert H. Humphrey, a senator from Minnesota who would go on to become Johnson's vice president. So pretty important people here standing with Dr. Novak. And he does die in, I believe, the 1970s. Or maybe, no, must be 1960s. Dies in the 1960s. He was born in 73, dies at age 92. And so who gets elected governor instead of Novak in 1936? Elmer Benson, a Farmer Labor Party member. He helped later on lead the merger between the Democrats and the Farmer Labor Party into the DFL. He was born in Appleton, Minnesota. And he was very much, probably much more liberal than Floyd B. Olson. One famous businessman pointed out that Floyd Olson used to make some radical comments, but he said Elmer Benson, this SOB, actually means them. And so that was kind of the difference between Floyd Olson and Elmer Benson, is Elmer Benson really tried to push some of the radical ideas, where Floyd Olson maybe just kind of mentioned them and moved on from them. Benson only is governor for 2 terms. In 1940, he loses out to a man named Harold Stassen, who would become a very famous Republican candidate. We'll talk more about him later on, but Harold Stassen called it kind of a progressive capitalism, and he supported the New Deal programs. He supported a lot of the social programs, but said a Republican can run them better than a Democrat can. And he actually kind of leads the way for the Republican Party in the state of Minnesota for quite a while. So that's a little bit of the important things happening in Minnesota in the 1930s. Obviously, many people were kind of down on their luck in the 1930s, like much of the country was. But for the most part, um, people stayed busy. They like anywhere else, they've made very something out of very little, and kind of worked their way back through the 1930s. And then of course World War II happens, and we that leads us out of